This is a reading from Laughing Torso by Nina Hamnet, 1932. Apparently, this woman was a contemporary of many artists in Paris in the 1920s, and it is a fascinating book, though I haven't been able to read all of it. I've decided I'm going to read you a passage from the book where she talks about Aleister Crowley. This is from the chapter called Back to Paris and Celebrities. So I assume sometime in the 20s. This was published in 1932, and it's about the same time he's at Sheffield, which is in the 20s. So let's get into it. I had met once in London at the Eiffel Tower a few months before a very good-looking young man who had been at Oxford. He had told me that he was coming to Paris and hoped to get into the diplomatic service. He spoke French, German, and Italian very well, and suddenly arrived in Paris from Italy. He had a charming voice and sang in all three languages. He visited exhibitions with me and took to wearing a large black hat, corduroy trousers, and black sand shoes. This I strongly disapproved of, as they did not suit him at all, and finally induced him to abandon them and wear his ordinary clothes. By this time I had had quite enough of artistic-looking people, long hair and shabby clothes, and was only too thankful to be seen about with a presentable person. Evan Morgan was still in Paris, and knew him very well. Aleister Crowley was there, and they were very anxious to be introduced to him, having heard the most dreadful stories of his wickedness. Crowley had a temple in Sheffield in Sicily. He was supposed to practice black magic there, and one day a baby was said to have disappeared mysteriously. There was also a goat there. This all pointed to black magic, so people said, and the inhabitants of the village were frightened of him. When he came to Paris, he stayed in the Rue Vavin at the Hôtel de Blois. I asked him if I could bring some friends to see him, and he asked us to come in one day before dinner and have some cocktails. He said that he had invented a beautiful cocktail called the Kubla Khan No. 2. He would not say what it was made of. I told Evan, and he and I and two young men went to try it out one evening. Crowley had only a small bedroom with a large cupboard. He opened the cupboard and took out a bottle of gin, a bottle of vermouth, and two other bottles. The last one was a small black bottle with an orange label on it, which was written "Poison." He poured some liquid from the large bottles, and then from the black bottle he poured a few drops and shook the mixture up. The poison, I found out afterwards, was laudanum. I believe that it is supposed to be an aphrodisiac, but it had no effect at all on any of us except Cecil Maitland, who was there also. After we left, he rushed into the street and in and out of all the cafes, behaving in a most strange manner, accosting everyone he came into contact with. I introduced J.W.N. Sullivan to Crowley. They got on very well together, as they were both very good chess players and very good mathematicians as well. I don't think that Sullivan was much interested in magic, but they found plenty to talk about. Crowley had taken to painting and painted the most fantastic pictures in very bright colors. He painted a picture about 1.5 feet wide and 9 inches high of a man on a white horse chasing a lion. It was very interesting, a little like Rousseau. It had a great deal of life and action. I would have liked to have bought it, but I was very broke, and he wanted a high price for it. He gave me a painting on a mahogany panel of a purple negress with a yellow and red spotted handkerchief round her head, and a purple rhinoceros surrounded by oriental vegetation. The rhinoceros had got rather mixed up with the vegetation, and it was rather difficult to distinguish between the trunks of the trees and the animal's anatomy. It was quite a beautiful color, however. His wife arrived from Sheffield. She was a tall, gaunt Jewess, very thin and bony, with a strangely attractive face and wild eyes. She had been a schoolmistress in New York. She had had a child by Crowley, which had died, and Crowley was very much upset about it. He showed me a photograph of himself and her with some children standing up to their knees in the sea with no clothes on. I got on very well with them. They were very anxious for me to go to Sheffield. I did not care for the type of person who clung around Crowley. They seemed so very inferior to him and so dull and boring that I could never understand how he could put up with them. Betty May, whom I had known in London in 1914 with Basil, arrived in Paris one day. She had been one of Epstein's models and one of the principal supports with Lillian Shelley of the Crabtree Club, which started in 1913. I only went once with Basil in 1914. Betty had married recently her fourth husband, a most brilliant young man called Raoul Loveday, who was only 20 and had got a first in history at Oxford. He was very good-looking, but also looked half dead. She was delighted to meet me, and we all sat in the dome and drank. They were on their way to Cefalù as Crowley had offered him a job as his secretary. He was very much intrigued with Crowley's views on magic. He had been very ill the year before and had had a serious operation. I had heard that the climate at Cefalù was terrible: heat, mosquitoes, and very bad food. The magical training I already knew was very arduous. I urged them not to go. I succeeded in keeping them in Paris 2 days longer than they intended, but they were determined to go, and I was powerless to prevent them. I told Raoul that if he went, he would die, and really felt a horrible feeling of gloom when I said goodbye to them. After 5 months, I had a postcard from Betty on which was written, "My husband died last Friday. Meet me at the Gare de Lyon." I could not meet her, as I got the postcard a day too late, and she went straight through to London. He died of fever. There were no doctors at Cefalù, and one had to be got from Palermo, but it was too late when he arrived. There is a long and very interesting description of life in Cefalù in Tiger Woman, Betty May's life story, but not half so good as the way in which she told me the story herself. Cecil Maitland and Mary Butts were very much interested in Crowley and went to Cefalù. Everyone in the temple had to write their diary every day, and everyone else was allowed to read it. The climate and the bad food nearly killed Cecil and Mary, and when they came back to Paris, they looked like two ghosts who were hardly recognizable. Crowley came to Paris from time to time. He gave the appearance of being quite bald, with the exception of a small bunch of hairs on top of his head, which he twiddled into a point. He shaved the back of his head and appeared entirely bald. One day I was sitting at the rotund, and a most extraordinary spectacle appeared. It wore a magnificent and very expensive grey velour hat. Underneath, sticking out on each side, was a mop of black frizzy hair, and the face was heavily made up and badly painted. This I recognized as Crowley. He said, "I'm going to Montmartre, and I don't know of any suitable cafes to visit." I could not think of anywhere he would not cause a sensation, but I suspected that was exactly what he wanted. I told him the names of a few suitable places, and he disappeared. I never saw him in this disguise again, and did not dare inquire whether he had a successful evening or not. He appeared sometimes in a kilt, and got hound down by the Americans who were rude enough to sing Harry Lauder's songs at him. He had a passion for dressing up. One day the Countess A., a Frenchwoman, asked me to lunch. I had been to her home several times before, and we were becoming very friendly. She spoke excellent English, and had heard about Crowley. She was most anxious to meet him. I refused to introduce him to her, as she had been very kind to me, and I knew how fond Crowley was of pulling the legs of people whom he suspected of being rich and influential. It was a curious kink that he had, which had lost him many opportunities and people that would have been useful and friendly to him. It was a kind of schoolboy perversity. A friend of mine introduced him to her, and she asked him to her house to lunch to meet some distinguished and rich women who were longing to have their horoscopes read. I was not at the luncheon party, but Crowley, I heard, had a great success and told them all kinds of things about themselves that they were dying to hear. He looked at the Countess and said, "I have met you in another life." She was naturally very intrigued, and asked him when and where, and he said that, in fact, he had written a story about her that had been published, and that he would send her a copy. This he eventually did, and to her horror, when she read it, it was a perfectly monstrous story about a perfectly monstrous and disreputable old woman bearing, of course, no resemblance to her. She was naturally furious and refused to see him again. One evening before the unfortunate incident took place, a man whom we all knew asked us to come to his flat and try a little hashish. I had never tried any, but only a few days before the Irish journalist whom I knew had told me about his experiences when he had tried some. It is not a habit-forming drug and does not do anyone much harm. The Irishman went to see some friends one day and they gave him some. I believe that one loses all sense of time and space. It takes about 100 years to cross a quite narrow street, and, as Maurice Richardson pointed out when I told him the story, probably 100 years to order a drink. The first effect is a violent attack of giggles. One screams with laughter for no reason whatever, even at a fly walking on the ceiling. The Irishman went through all the stages and finally decided to go home. He had to walk across Paris and cross the river by Notre Dame. When he reached it, he found that it was at least a mile high, and giving in one despairing look, sat down on the quays to wait till its size had diminished. He had to wait some time, but finally he decided that it had grown small enough for him to continue his walk home. The Countess had asked Crowley to dinner, and he appeared in what he considered to be suitable evening clothes. He wore black silk knee breeches, a tight-fitting black coat, black silk stockings, and shoes with buckles on them. The coat had a high collar, with a narrow white strip at the top. On his chest he wore a jeweled order, and at his side he carried a sword. I asked him what the order was. He said, "The Order of the Holy Ghost, my dear." We went to our friend's flat after dinner. He had a large pot on the floor which contained hashish in the form of jam. On the table were some pipes, as one smoked or ate it, or did both. I tasted a spoonful, swallowed it, and waited, but nothing happened. The others got to work seriously, and smoked and ate the jam. I felt no effect except that I was very happy, much more happy than if I had drunk anything. I sat on a chair and grinned. The others entered the giggling stage. This was for me a most awful bore, as I could not say a word of any kind without them roaring with laughter. I got so bored that I went home. Crowley eventually returned to Sheffield, taking his wife with him, and so we had no more Kubla Khan No. 2.